Chapter 19. Mackenzie hadn't been back to the middle school since middle school, not that she minded being back now. There was a comfort to walking the halls of her childhood. Those years were some of her happiest. Her father got his shit together for a while, meaning she had clean clothes and a full belly. She'd had her 3 best friends and enjoyed learning, reveling in the warm feeling of approval from her teachers. And really, if you had to hang out somewhere during an apocalypse, then a school with bright paintwork and motivational posters wasn't a terrible choice. The cafeteria hadn't changed at all. It had a nostalgic scent, not altogether pleasant, but reassuring all the same. Now that she was on the other side of the lunch counter, Mackenzie was gaining an appreciation for where the smell originated. Here I was thinking that eggs came from chickens and were cracked out of shells, Mackenzie said to Rachel. Who knew they were actually powder in a box? It's ridiculous how many foods have been dehydrated and reduced to powder, agreed Rachel. It's not like kids need to eat real food, right? Not that they were begrudging the huge stockpile of food. Thank the Lord for well-organized lunch ladies. When Mackenzie had arrived an hour ago, a team of women were clearing and washing breakfast dishes, and another several were debating what they were going to produce for lunch, for over 300 people. Rachel had thrown up her hands and stomped away. I'm a vet, not a goddamn cook. I say the men find their own fucking food. For the first time since this began, Mackenzie's spine straightened with a sense of purpose. Sanford might not need an environmental lawyer, but food? She knew food. She'd spent a childhood getting inventive with sparse ingredients, making it stretch as far as it could. As an adult, she'd taken pleasure in knowing her bank account could support a full grocery cart and indulged in cooking elaborate gourmet meals. She'd decided on frittatas for lunch. It was easy enough to make in large quantities and would help what fresh food they had stretch farther. The other women were mostly grateful to have someone directing them, although a few gave her distasteful looks, and she didn't miss the hissed trailer trash that was lobbed her way. Is cilantro too much to ask for? Mac muttered, running a finger along the food shelves as she walked up and back. The only spice that school cafeterias have is bland. You're wasting your time, said Rachel, who'd relented and was energetically slashing at sweet potatoes. What are you two nattering for? Lunch needs to be ready to be served in 45 minutes. Mrs. White tisked, a 60-something widow who'd presided over the Sanford Women's Club for the last decade and, having arrived several minutes ago, was intent on presiding over the cafeteria kitchen too. She turned to the industrial sink, where women were rinsing the breakfast dishes and stacking the dishwasher, hindered somewhat by Jean Fisquet, who was washing tomatoes. My dear, now is not the time to be washing fruit for the frittata, she scolded, picking up a stray dish towel and swishing it in Jean's direction. It needs to be chopped, and pronto. Jean's face fell, tears falling unchecked. Oh dear, no need for tears, Mrs. White soothed, her kindness marred by an underlying briskness. I know these are trying times, but we need to get on with our jobs. My Bill, he's in quarantine, and no one will tell me how he is, Jean whispered, wringing her wet hands. Cocking her head, Mackenzie stilled in her perusal of the shelves, listening. The quarantine issue had been playing on her mind all morning. She didn't necessarily want to see her father, but she'd like to know where he was. Having not seen him at either the town meeting or the bar last night, she suspected he'd been taken to the hospital. Why has no one gone to check on the hospital? She asked. The other women ignored her. She has a point, Rachel interjected. We're all wondering what's happening, and Townsend tells us they have it under control. But why hasn't anyone gone to check? Mrs. White gave them a side look and tutted at them to keep her voice down. Because, Jean whispered, the last people who announced they were going to check didn't come back, and Townsend has instructed that anyone who leaves the safe zone isn't allowed back in. I'm sure we'll hear news when there is some, Mrs. White said. I heard the bus drivers who took them away didn't come back either, one of the women at the sink said. Enough chit-chat, ladies. We have work to do. Back to it, Mrs. White scolded. What do you think is happening at the hospital? Mackenzie murmured, sidling up to Rachel. 3/4 of the town are up there. They wouldn't even all fit inside. How do we not know what's happening? I heard they were using the undercover parking lot, which would make sense, but I honestly don't think— She paused. Don't think what? Mac, you've seen how fast this virus progresses once symptoms present. I don't think there are going to be any survivors. It's been 4 days. I doubt anyone at the hospital is still alive, she finished somberly. Looking at the quietly sobbing Jean, Mackenzie swallowed, intensely grateful the people she cared about most in this world weren't at the hospital, which was instantly followed by a slug of shame. Did she really not care that her father might be dead? They hadn't had a relationship in years, and she harbored a deep resentment for the shitty parenting he'd afforded her, but it was disconcerting to feel so little about his welfare. What did that say about her? What would Jake think of her being so callous? Jake. Warmth infused her chest. She totally had the hots for her best friend's little brother. How had this happened? Closing her eyes, she ran a finger over her lips, a fierce longing almost making her tremble, even as the weight of their new world pressed down. Even if she was starting something with him, and to be fair, their recent between the sheets and against the door antics indicated that convincingly she still wasn't prepared for the whole of Sanford to weigh in. She'd had enough of the town's judgment to last a lifetime. Her stomach gave a little flip, remembering the way he'd sucked her finger last night. Just as quickly, a prickle of guilt washed over her. People were dead, dying, and she was behaving like a lovesick teenager, not to mention deceiving her best friend. I know things are fucked up at the moment, but I am seriously disturbed that Vivian Oxley is the one who's in charge of looking after the kids in the creche, Kat announced, wandering back into the kitchen. She'd played hooky not long after Mackenzie had arrived. She doesn't have a maternal bone in her body. She's like one of those insects that eats its mate once they've had sex. Kat jumped up to sit on the counter. Hygiene, Kat, Rachel reprimanded. Get off the food prep worktop. You know what I overheard? Kat continued blithely. Jim Boston's got some biohazard suits. Fuck knows where he got them from for the raid they're going on tonight. Stop calling it a raid, griped Rachel, and get off the counter, make yourself useful, and go check that batch of frittatas in the oven. Kat ignored her. You know what else I heard? Kat's voice lowered and took on a gravity that had both Mackenzie and Rachel pausing. Old Mrs. Murray was beaten when they found out she'd hidden gas. What? Mackenzie gasped, frittatas forgotten. Is she okay? Some bruising on her face, and maybe a broken wrist, Kat said somberly. Are the whole of the council on drugs? Rachel exploded. My mother would never have allowed this shit to happen. Hopefully she'll be back soon and can reason with them, Mackenzie said. They're beyond reasoning with. They're power-hungry, chauvinistic assholes, Rachel spat, swiping her eyes to hide brimming tears. Why isn't help coming? Kat questioned. Mac, you said you saw the military in Chicago, didn't you? And a convoy in Essex? Surely we'll get some kind of information soon. A vaccine. Something. They quietened as Mrs. White passed by, and Mackenzie's gaze swung intuitively to the kitchen's back door, just as Jake walked through. His eyes scanned the room until he found her, a dimple popping in his cheek with that cocky grin. Tipping his head, he gestured for her to follow before backing away. Glancing around furtively, Mackenzie responded on light feet, slipping around boxed supplies and disappearing from the room unseen. Jake was pulling her to him before the door had even snicked closed, and, although she wanted nothing more than to bury her head against his chest, her thoughts were so far from romantic it wasn't funny. What is it? He asked, his finger lifting her chin so his concerned gaze could capture hers. Not wanting to get frisky in the dirty alley behind the cafeteria? I'm scared, was all she could muster. Mac didn't know how to put into words the overload of emotion and information. Jake responded by tugging her closer, wrapping strong arms around her as he settled his chin on top of her head. The virus isn't going to breach Sanford. It's not the virus that has me most worried, she admitted. I mean, it is, but it's the effect it's had on everything. We have no idea what's happening, and the council is acting crazy. What do you mean, crazy? He pulled back, his brow furrowed. The council is keeping us safe. They've got a plan to get us through this. Mackenzie weighed her response. It unnerved her that Jake wasn't seeing where she was coming from. Who is going to keep us safe from the council? Jake cocked his head. Sitting heavily on a stack of overturned milk crates, he patted another for Mackenzie to join him. Why would we need to be kept safe from the council? Unable to sit still, she paced before him. Don't you find the level of control they're exerting disturbing? Surely he could acknowledge that. Nothing about this new world was normal, but having a gun-toting, self-promoted militia protecting them wasn't normal. I know that no one has breached the blockades set up along the roads leading into Sanford, Jake said, and men are risking their lives in patrols to ensure our safety. Exactly. Men. What's with all the patriarchal bullshit about keeping women in the kitchen? And don't you wonder if the patrols are more about keeping us in rather than others out? We're not prisoners, Mac. Jake's voice had hardened, and he was looking at her like he didn't know her. Where's this coming from? Kat just heard that Mrs. Murray was assaulted because she didn't hand over all her gas. I'll admit someone got carried away, but the council were requisitioning gas for a reason. Everything is unprecedented at the moment, he defended. Mackenzie breathed out in frustration, coming to a stop in front of him. She was beaten up for hiding gas. They stared wordlessly at each other, knees touching, but a world of difference between them. I don't like the council taking everything, she said finally, watching her boot make patterns in the loose gravel. If we can gather supplies of our own, we won't have to rely on the council. Absolutely not. Her head snapped up. Excuse me? Since when did Jake have the right to speak to her like that, to dictate her actions? Absolutely not, he repeated. Just because we're whatever we are, she waved an emphatic hand between them, doesn't mean you can tell me what I can and can't do. You go outside the safe zone, and you could be shot trying to re-enter. She gaped at him. There's a reason for everything Townsend is doing, Mac. Her head was spinning, and she slumped down onto the crate. She didn't care about the reasons. She cared that men in their town thought they could punish with impunity. She cared that Jake agreed with them. So, get that idea out of your head, Mac. I forbid you from leaving the safety of the safe zone. I beg your pardon, Mackenzie snapped. You forbid me? An imminent headache began knocking with persistence. I don't want to fight with you, he said, grasping at her suddenly chilled hands. You know I just want to keep you safe. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. The word forbid was echoing between them, and she couldn't force her hands to grip his in return. He carried on, oblivious. I came to let you know I'm going to go on the raid to Dutton. We leave late this afternoon. Pulling her hands away, she pressed her back against the wall to create some distance between them. Distance that physically pained her, even as her insides were flayed with each word he spoke. It's not a raid, he amended. It's just a scavenging trip to get a fuel tanker. Disbelief made her rigid. I can't go out there, but you can? What if you get infected? Regardless of her anger at his pig-headed and misdirected intentions, Mac was petrified for his safety. Petrified that he was leaving her. She stood on unsteady legs, and he followed suit. I won't. We're taking precautions, and we'll make sure not to get too close to anyone. The fuel depot is on the edge of town. I'll be back before you know it, he promised. But she was not to be deterred. So Townsend's now a general, and you're his little soldier going out on commando missions? It's a quick trip to do a little recon and grab some gas. I promise it's not a big deal. Not a big deal, she cried, pushing her hands against his chest to make him back away. The world is dying out there. It's chaos, and you know it's not safe. Mac, are you out here? Came Kat's voice. They both started turning toward the back cafeteria door. Kat's head popped around, scowling when she saw them. Seriously? We're trying to feed a shit ton of people right now, and you're having a deep and meaningful conversation? I'm coming, Mackenzie mumbled, trying to push past him. Hey, babe, you're not leaving like this. You're right. I'm not leaving you. You are, she retorted, sidestepping him. See you when you get back. She tossed over her shoulder as she went inside.